All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hope you all had a good weekend. We're now officially in the 5th week. We are also currently in the last day of January. This felt like it's gone on forever. So we're moving right along with the quarter. We have some updates in regards to some upcoming assignments and just things to have on your radar. So we'll be getting to those in just a minute, including your first larger essay for this class that I'll be talking about in just a little bit. So to get us started for today, I wanted to do the opportunity to brainstorm and start to think about some things that will directly to help you to complete this essay. As we'll be talking about in just a second here, the first essay for this class gives you 3 different prompts to choose from, and we'll let you explore and develop based on the prompt that you find the most interesting for this class. So I want to give you an initial opportunity to start to brainstorm and to think about how you might approach this topic. So what I want you to do is, as part 1 of your attendance for today, I want you to address these different prompts. And your response to these does not need to be very long, but it's an opportunity to start to think about and use some of these ideas. First of all, in your own words, what does it mean to listen professionally? Last week, we discussed the idea of listening professionally, including its applications to careers and the workplace. We looked at 2 different articles that have approached what it means to communicate in business and professional settings in very different ways. So you might use that to inform what you know about what it means to listen professionally. You also might think about going back to the 3rd week of class, the way that media impacts listening. So we talked a lot about how things such as Zoom, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on can actually be seen as a form of listening. But we've also brought up some of the challenges that that type of listening can have compared to listening to other people face to face. And then lastly, I want you to think about 2 different ways that people listen. And you can think about this in terms of different types of listening that we brought up. 3 major types to consider would be active listening versus critical listening versus empathic listening. And those types of listening have very different expectations, goals, and so on. So I'll give you some time to work on this and to start to think about some of the ways that you can contrast different approaches to listening. we'll give people a couple more minutes to work on this. Yeah, Willie. So because of the, yeah, sure. So my goal is to get it to you by Friday. Because of folks that have done the get out of jail free card, I have to give that week and not return feedback until everybody's got it in, but I should be able to have everybody's in by that. Yeah. Go ahead and finish what you're currently writing or working on. The brainstorming that you've started to do for today, again, is going to be directly helpful for you as you think about and prepare for writing your first essay for the class. You'll notice, right, that these questions directly correspond to different weeks and things that we've gone over in class. For instance, listening professionally was last week. Listening in media was week 3. In the first 2 weeks of class, we were getting at what it means to listen and the ways that we listen, particularly face-to-face. So what I want to do now is go over this essay, my expectations, and what you should expect related to this assignment before kicking off some of our new material for this week related to the idea of rhetorical listening and the ways that listening can connect to things like culture and gender. So the first essay is due on February 13th. As I mentioned, I like to do a couple things. First of all, give people at least 2 weeks to prepare and think about this assignment, and also to give a buffer between the first writing assignment in the class and this one since last Wednesday. So I want to go over, again, the formal prompt here and the things that I'm looking for completing this assignment. So you'll notice if you go to the Canvas page for this course that you will be able to access the prompt. To access the prompt for this assignment, if you scroll down to week number 6, it'll show under there as the essay number 1. Originally, the first essay was going to be due by the end of this week, but because of the snow days and extension and delays, I didn't think that would be a fair time at all to give you, so I wanted to extend that out to the following week. So if you click here, you can access the prompt for the assignment. Again, I like the combination of giving people direction and also giving people choice in writing. This is a 300 level class, so the writing length and expectations are a bit more than you might expect in a 200 level class, including for those of you that are taking small group with me. So what I want to do is go through what these different prompts might look like. I'm asking you to, in 4 pages, double space, standard font and margins, choose one of the 3 to write about, right? And like the listening assessment that you did earlier in the class, I'm asking you to include in-text citations in a works cited list. So these 3 different prompts directly connect to what I was asking you to think about and to start brainstorming earlier today. The first prompt is about media. So particularly, how does media shape listening? I want you to, as part of that, compare and contrast the ways that people communicate and listen face-to-face versus using media. Whether or not you feel like one of these 2 forms of listening is better than the other. Also some of the ways that people use media to listen. For instance, some of the different channels like Zoom, texting, Twitter, and so on. I'm asking you to incorporate at least 2 different readings from the class in your response that would be relevant to the issues of listening and media, right? So We have one that for sure would be a good choice. The piece on Crawford. You could also think about the earlier or maybe even later readings on professional listening. Yeah, Garrett?
Should we, or would you, I guess, be expecting us to include outside sources on these?
So you'd want to include 2 sources that are directly from the class. If there are sources outside of that you think are relevant or useful, you can, but you just want to make sure that it directly links and connects to the class, right? If you were just talking about those outside readings exclusively, you would risk getting off topic. But if you can make those outside sources relevant to the class, you can. So that's a good question, right? So the sources that you incorporate do not need to be from outside of the class, but you need to include at least 2 sources from this class. So again, that could be the Crawford piece, or it could be our first week's reading related to listening. The second prompt is about professional listening. So if you found that area of listening interesting to you in terms of professional or applied listening, you can focus on that second prompt. This second prompt asks what it means to be a professional listener, right? So you might define here in this prompt what it means to use professional listening, the steps necessary to do so, and how somebody can incorporate professional listening into their career or professional life, right? We've talked a little bit about the ways that you can use professional listening to improve your listening in the workplace. You also, in your response, might want to think about the ways that listening has oftentimes been disregarded or not seen as important in professional settings, despite the benefits that professional listening has. And again, like the first prompt, I'm asking you to incorporate at least 2 readings from the class related to professional listening and an example of a professional listening career or situation in which these skills are used, right? So that's the second prompt. So if you found professional listening interesting, you can choose that one. And then for the final prompt, you can think about some of the different ways that people listen. So this more specifically connects to the first couple weeks of class. I'm asking you to identify at least 2 of the different types of listening that we've talked about. So active listening, empathetic listening, and critical listening. Pick 2 of those. And some of the ways that they differ in terms of their goals, their feedback, their style, their context. When would you use one form of listening versus another? And how you would use these types of listening styles in your own life. Again, use at least 2 different readings from the class and an example of situations in which these different types of listening would be used. So what I would encourage you to do is to use this week to make a decision for yourself about which of these prompts you find the most interesting. Maybe it's the prompt that you were here for the most amount of class for, or the prompt that connects to you the most, or the one that you feel like you're the most excited or jazzed to talk about. I would use this week to figure that out, make a decision by the end of the week, and then break this prompt down, right, into maybe some of the ways that you organize your essay. Again, I wanted to give you a lot to work with and have clear expectations on these. Again, make sure that you're only choosing one, right? So what would not be an acceptable assignment would be to do 2 pages, run out of things to say, and then choose a different prompt for the other 2 pages. So just choose one of these 3. And I'm sure there's plenty to draw from in filling the 4 pages that can answer one of these prompts. Like before, I'll look over rough drafts or outlines. Willie also asked about feedback on the shorter writing assignment. Again, because of the get out of jail free card buffer, I'm going to wait until at least Wednesday when remaining folks turn that in. My goal is to get feedback to you on Friday. That way you can use that feedback to help with completing this essay. Next page has the rubric. Again, I'm looking for, have you picked a prompt? Do you have a clear thesis statement and introduction? Are you applying and using concepts from the course to make sense of the prompt, right? Are you showing you understand these ideas? And I'm really looking for your ability to apply and use relevant elements of professional communication, communication in media, or communication face-to-face. Structure and style are pretty similar. Again, 4 pages, clear sentences and paragraphs, and style, right? MLA, APA, or Chicago, and clean, clear conventions. Again, I recommend the rule of giving yourself an extra day or two before the assignment is due to take a step away, look at it, and use some time to fix your conventions. Any questions related to this assignment, including expectations, structure, anything like that? Again, I know that sometimes folks have a little bit of trouble with filling in space, which is why I wanted to use several sentences to really clearly lay out the prompt and the different parts of the prompt. So I think you'll have a lot of work that you can draw from there. My advice is if you find yourself having difficulty meeting the 4 pages, that you incorporate more in terms of citations and direct references to terms and concepts from the course that can help you to fill in that space. So that's coming up. Again, it'll be due on the 13th. It's a Sunday. So knowing that that's coming up, I wanted to use some time to do a quick refresher of the things that we went over last class. Last Friday, I asked you all to share what we put together for your listening assessment assignments. It was cool to hear the conversations that you had and what you gained from those conversations and listening, right? We learned a lot about listening, but we also know that there are things that we can do to be better listeners. We talked about some of the challenges of listening professionally. We had a scenario, right, that was involving preparing for and thinking about listening in professional situations. And we also discussed this idea that it can be really difficult in professional settings for listening to be seen as valuable or important, right? I really liked the suggestions you all brought to the table last Friday about ideas such as using things like surveys or anonymous feedback in order to get a sense of how people feel about their professional environment in ways to make their listening a little bit better. These are things to hold on to and to think about if you were to choose the professional listening prompt for your essay. Again, Purdy and Manning were the authors that we've been talking about last Wednesday and last Friday. Look at what business and listening means. We talked a little bit about culture. Again, the idea that the shared combination of things that make us who we are define and explain culture. And again, we'll be getting into more of those details this week in our discussion about rhetorical listening. And some of the ways that things like sensitivity and consideration of other cultures, the use of self-awareness are all really important things. And this thread that Purdy and Manning bring up, that listening is oftentimes under-discussed when we're thinking about culture or social issues, that listening is a thing that we take for granted, a thing that's just sort of there, is really useful information for us to think about as we get into some of the new stuff for today. So for this class, it should be rhetoric. We'll explore the history and context of rhetoric, the goals of rhetorical listening, and some of the skills surrounding rhetorical listening. I'm curious, has anybody here taken a class related to rhetoric? So for instance, a writing and rhetoric style course that engages in those kinds of issues? Yeah, related. Okay. So there's rhetoric is an interesting and really cool area to explore. Rhetoric is something that we offer through a lot of the English and writing courses, including folks such as professors such as Jim Benton, are people that specialize in areas of rhetorical study. So rhetoric, I think Dr. Corey Brewster is also somebody that does a lot of really cool rhetoric related to social movements, social and cultural issues, and so on. So I definitely recommend taking a writing or rhetoric course if you find these ideas interesting and want to explore them in more detail. Rhetoric is also closely tied to communication and is going to be relevant for us as we think about listening in just a second. So rhetoric, right, is about how we use persuasion. So you can think about it as the way that not just messages exist, but the way that messages influence or impact each other. So rhetoric is not just concerned about the idea that we communicate, that we work together, that somebody gives a speech, right? But about the impact or effect that that message has on society, right? And rhetoric is something that we can sort of date all the way back to Aristotle, right? Aristotle very much developed the idea of rhetoric to try to understand the way that we engage in persuasion and its impact on society. So I want to start here and start with this overview of rhetoric and what rhetoric means, because it'll be useful for us to think about what rhetorical listening means, right? And what it means to use rhetorical listening. Can't understand rhetorical listening if you don't understand rhetoric. So rhetoric is something that was developed by the Greeks. And at the time, right, rhetoric was not necessarily seen as a particularly great or valuable thing. In fact, Greeks were rather known for saying that rhetoric was not necessarily a skill, the same way that something like gardening or architecture or mathematics was a skill. No, rhetoric was just a knack. It's a thing that you could do in the same way that you know how to change a tire, right? It's not a really amazing or really useful skill. And the reason why rhetoric was seen as not a particularly great skill was out of a fear that rhetoric would, quote, make the weaker argument the stronger. A really good example for this is if you think about a used car salesperson. So you go to buy a car, right? And you know that there's an entire trope and stereotype that people that sell used cars, right, are sleazy and are going to try to get you to overpay for a car that is going to be a total lemon, right? That's going to break down and not be useful. But you know that the salesperson is going to sell that car to you and do their absolute darndest to make that car seem amazing, right? To close the deal. And that's something that we find ourselves really anxious about. The idea that people would dupe us, right, would trick us and use persuasion in order to make that happen. So the concern, going all the way back to the Greeks, was that making a persuasive message does not necessarily mean that the message is true, right? We notice this a lot when it comes to social or like political issues. We hear a candidate speak and try to make their case, right? And we know that that person, their ultimate goal is to get us to vote for them or to support them or to donate them and so on. That they're going to be selective about the messages that they choose and the way that they choose to share them out of a goal of trying to convince us. So the concern, going back to the Greeks, is that rhetoric is not about an art. It's not about truth. It's not about really being a good speaker. It's about trying to convince people or get people onto your side, right? There's been a lot of disagreement and debate about what rhetoric is. In fact, a lot of people have said, no, rhetoric can be an art. It can be this really detailed and useful skill. For instance, if you take a class such as public speaking, right, it provides fundamental skills in how to do good persuasive speaking, on how to use particular strategies of organization and delivery that can help you to convey a message. Rhetoric can be a really useful skill when it comes to issues like social and political change, right? But I think it is important to place in context this fear that guides a lot of the way that we think about rhetoric and what it means. When it comes to rhetoric, I think it's also important as part of a crash course to talk about some of the different proofs and some of the ways that rhetoric happens. How many people have heard ethos, pathos, logos before? Yeah, so a couple of you, including those that have taken a class in rhetoric, right? So these are what we would consider to be different proofs. So Aristotle, the Greeks, right, thought that in a perfect world, all we would have is logos. Logos being the use of logical appeals, right? The appeals to logic, to reasoning in order to make sense of society. I'm curious, is there anybody here that's seen Star Trek, either the movies or the old shows? Oh, well. So I was a pretty big Star Trek fan growing up, right? If you've ever seen Star Trek, there's a character in the shows and the movies called Spock, right? He's pretty famous because he's half Vulcan, which is a race of alien beings with pointy ears and like the eyebrows that go down, right? That suppress or control their emotions because they just use logic, right? So if you watch the original series with Leonard Nimoy, or you watch the more recent Star Trek movies, right? Spock's character is designed to be very cool and level-headed and just uses logic all the time, to the point of annoying people, right? In a perfect world, the Greeks thought that all we would have is logic. We would just have logos, right? That people are rational, that they just make decisions based on whatever information they have and arrive at the best conclusions. One example of the use of logic is the syllogism. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. All men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is man, right? You can also do that the other way, right? All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? You're making a major premise, a minor premise, and reaching a conclusion based off of those claims. But we know that we are not in a society where people just make decisions based on logic, right? That we're human beings, we have flaws, we have emotions, we have feelings, and all of those things are going to dictate the ways that we communicate. So that's where ethos and pathos become really important. Ethos refers to the idea that credibility and background is really important. We think back to the used car salesperson. We think about the fact that there's somebody who might not necessarily be trustworthy. They could try to get us to buy a car, but could lie to us and say, oh, this has another 100,000 miles, and it breaks down after the first 200, right? So ethos or credibility is really important to us to feel like we can trust the person and the message that they're trying to bring. For instance, if you get to know a close friend and they tell you a story about a time that they went skiing, but you know for a fact that they could not have gone skiing at that time, or don't like skiing, you might doubt them, right? You might question their credibility. Especially when we think about critical listening, right? Listening to really understand the message and see if that message is true or not, right? Ethos becomes really important. We are more likely to listen to people that we trust and that we believe in, right? This is really true when it comes to the way that we use media, including how we follow the news or other current events, right? We're more likely to listen to perspectives or views that we trust or that align more closely with our social or political views, right? So ethos matters. Ethos shapes our credibility and understanding of an issue. Secondarily is pathos, right? Pathos is an appeal to emotion. Best example I can give of how we use pathos in listening is if you've ever seen, like when you're watching TV or there's an advertisement that comes up for some of the shelters for animals, right, or the ASPCA, there are these like really sad commercials that are oftentimes in black and white. They play somber music, and it's like pets in cages, right? Those are ads that are designed to tug at your heartstrings to get you to adopt a pet. Look at how sad these pets are that aren't being adopted. You should go get them. So that's an example of a pathos. And pathos can be a problem, right? If we're using emotions in the place of a logical or supportive argument. But emotions do matter, right? For humans, when we see somebody that's sad or upset, we're going to listen to them and try to figure out ways to help. So these different proofs are useful for us to think about listening because we care about credibility. We care about the emotions and feelings that people bring to the table, especially in terms of empathetic listening. We also care about the logic or sense that that message has when we think about things like critical listening, right? We can also think about 3 different contexts in which persuasion or rhetoric happens. Epididactic, which is the tricky one to pronounce. Epididactic is concerned with celebration or censure in the present. So for some of you that are here for your first year at EOU, right, you graduated high school or graduated from a community or junior college, right, and that graduation celebration was epididactic. It was an opportunity in the present to acknowledge the achievements and work that you did. Something like a funeral where you're honoring somebody that's passed away, or a wedding could also be an example of an epididactic form. Deliberative is about the future, right? Deliberative might be you and a group of friends that are a member of a philosophy team or group on campus that's thinking about what to do next, like hosting some sort of event or activity, right? Deliberative is about the future, deliberating or deciding what to do. And forensic is about the past. If you've ever seen some of those, classic shows that are about crime, so again, a lot of those procedurals like NCIS, Criminal Minds, Bones, all of those types of shows, right? They're forensic. Somebody was murdered. What the heck happened? You're using evidence to try to figure out and make sense of the past. So past, present, future, right? These are contexts in which we use rhetoric to communicate, but also to listen to each other, right? Because forensic, making sense of the past, helps us to listen to and understand what happened. This is especially important when we think about history in the United States. How is history talked about or read or discussed, including in things like high school curriculum, right? That's been an area of a lot of discussion and debate. Deliberative is important for listening because if we're trying to make a decision or do something, we need to listen to other people in order to make listening work. And epididactic matters for listening too. If we're celebrating or doing some type of ritual or event now, it's important for us to be present and thoughtful about that situation. So again, I know this might be a refresher to some of you, but I do think that understanding some elements of rhetoric is important to understanding and placing it in context of this week's reading. Rhetoric, right, is more than dead white guys, and it's moved way beyond that, I think, as a way to really situate and discuss the challenges of contemporary social, political, and cultural issues, right? I think it's fair to say that we live in a time where there's a lot of substantial civic and public unrest, right? We've seen this in the context of protests, of demonstrations, including things related to COVID-19, right? Related to Black Lives Matter, related to a whole host of issues surrounding climate and the environment. And there are just so many different topics or issues where using rhetoric can be useful, right? It helps us to understand areas in which there's social and political disagreement. Again, a lot of my research and work is to examine how folks with disabilities engage in communication for social change. It also looks at a lot of contemporary issues related to things like race, identity, gender, and again, a lot of the aspects that make us who we are. Rhetoric is a way of advocating for and engaging in these kinds of issues, including the ways that we use media, right? Using Twitter, Facebook, Zoom, Instagram, and so on as a way of listening for and advocating for issues. Rhetoric is also useful, right? Because understanding persuasion and the ways that messages move us is a useful skill that we can incorporate into our own lives. If we're trying to persuade other people to do something, maybe we join a nonprofit or an activist organization that we really care about. Rhetoric helps us to understand how we can make our message matter. So again, rhetoric is really useful to thinking about listening because we listen to messages that can persuade and move us on a regular basis. Listening helps us to understand how rhetoric works. Listening connects to rhetoric in a lot of different ways. Some of the ways that we do so, right? Listening is a rhetorical strategy. One of the key ideas that the author brings up, that Ratcliffe brings up for this week, is that we can choose to listen as a strategy. That is, we can be more persuasive or we can be more influential, right? If we choose to listen. Think about it this way. The better you understand the message that you disagree with, the more specific and focused your response to that message can be. If we find ourselves agreeing for or wanting to support or uplift the message, right? We can use listening as a way to get there. Listening helps us to understand the rhetoric of the message. If we're using critical listening, right? If we're trying to understand what the claims are here. And I gave the example of whenever a president gives a major address, like a State of the Union or something like a presidential debate, typically news media sources will do a fact check of the text of what was said and use that to assess the rhetoric of the message, and whether or not the major claims being offered here could be supported through facts, right? And then lastly, listening assists in the invention of messages. That is, if we listen to messages that work, messages that persuade, messages that influence society, right? That helps us to develop our own toolkit and way of advocating for issues. For instance, right? Say you want to be a motivational speaker, and that's a major goal out of your life, to be a motivational speaker. Great. In order to do that, you're probably going to listen to motivational speeches from other people. You're going to use those examples to help to inform how you're going to create and craft messages that are important. So listening really ties pretty closely to the role of rhetoric in terms of social and cultural issues. So the reading for this week comes from Dr. Linda Ratcliffe, or Crystal Ratcliffe, who's professor of English at ASU, Arizona State, right? And like I mentioned before, as we transition into these articles, I know that as you work through articles, there are going to be terms, concepts, and ideas that you're not familiar with. Parts of the reading might be confusing or a little bit weird, right? That's okay. You don't need to get it all down verbatim. I think the goal is to really try to understand what some of the key arguments and points are related to what's being suggested in the reading. So you might pay attention to the major thesis or argument that the author brings to the table. And again, you're welcome to disagree with any of the ideas or claims being presented. None of the readings in classes are gospel, right? They are opportunities for us to think and to engage on some of these issues. But Ratcliffe's concern, right, is how listening can connect to rhetoric and how we can do rhetorical listening. Because just like in professional and other contexts, right, listening is not something that people who study or do rhetoric are very focused on. They don't really think about what listening does or how listening can be useful. In fact, as Ratcliffe mentions, listening is oftentimes taken for granted. It's just the thing people do, rather than a skill or practice that can be considered as a part of the process. In this way, Ratcliffe's thesis, it's an idea that we're going to be exploring in more detail as this week continues, is that rhetorical listening, the idea of using listening as it connects to things like persuasion, is useful for interpretive invention. That is, by interpreting, again, one of those 5 stages, right? For understanding the message, we get to develop our own sense of what the message means and engage with that message, especially on issues related to identity and marginality. Again, things like race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, sexual orientation, and so on. So listening gives us a toolkit for engaging with messages. That'll be an important thesis for us to continue to explore as we get into some of the greater details of this week's reading. And we'll be doing that on Wednesday and Friday. But I do want to use some time for now to have you do the part 2 of today's prompt. What I want you to think about is a time that you were persuaded by listening to someone else. You could think, for instance, about maybe a friend, a family member, somebody else close to you, and so on, that you found was somewhat persuasive or that influenced you in one way or another, right? For instance, last week, my partner convinced me to get my TikTok account started because she was helping me to understand a lot of the really cool ways that it uses messages to connect to people and use like algorithms that help you to see videos that you would find enjoyable, right? You might think about a time that you were persuaded as well. I want you to think about what it was about that person and their message that you found persuasive. Why is it that that person influenced you or changed your mind? And then secondarily, I want you to think about how listening helped you to understand that message. Doesn't need to be a big, major persuasive thing. It could be something as simple as, hey, they told me to go to this new restaurant, or they told me to, try doing cardio or something like that, right? Be very light depending on what you are thinking about. So I'll give you some time to work on this. Take a minute or two. So it looks like most people are just about wrapped up on this. So I'd like to hear from a couple volunteers to share the message they heard that was persuasive and how they incorporated listening to that message. Is there anybody who'd like to share? Yeah, Liv.
I just used it. My friends and I were deciding on different restaurants to go to, and one of them really wanted to go to Texas Roadhouse, so she threw out that if we went there, then we get free rolls with like honey butter or whatever, so we'd be getting more food for free technically. So she used more of a logical appeal in her message because she was throwing out the fact that and then by listening, it helped me understand the pros and cons of each restaurant that the person threw out.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, right? Listening helps us to really try to figure out the different options available to us, things like pros and cons that we get to develop in more detail over time to give us. I'd like to hear from one more person who has an example here that they are interested in sharing. Nicole, how about you?
I also use an example where they persuaded me using logos.
Yeah.
When me and my partner wanted to go bungee jumping on our vacation before COVID, I was really nervous about it. And they're like, you know, there's like a rope and you've been skydiving like twice. Why are you freaking out? And so that allowed me to like take a step back and be like, oh yeah, there's a rope and driving here was like statistically more dangerous. Let's jump off a bridge. So yeah.
Yeah, I really like the way that listening, like when it comes to things like rhetoric and persuasion, can remind us, right? Hey, you've been skydiving before, or hey, driving is more dangerous, right? Listening gives us the opportunity to remember and use what people have told us as a way to help us make informed decisions. So I really like the use of that example. So thanks for sharing. I really appreciate you two bringing that into the discussion about what listening can add to our conversation and approach to rhetoric. To wrap up for today, right, we talked a little bit about how listening can be used rhetorically. Again, we did a bit of a crash course on the history of rhetoric and the way that it shapes our relationships and some of the ways that listening can connect the use of rhetorical appeals. On Wednesday, we're going to get deeper into Ratcliffe's specific argument and what rhetorical listening looks like. So that'll be our discussion for next class. Again, I recommend brainstorming what you do the prompt and starting to think about what you want to write for that or first essay. Please email or pass forward your attendance for today and have a great rest of your Monday. See you soon.